welcome back for episode 3 of It's Expensive, but Is It Good? Today, our choice comes from one of the most expensive trilogies in all of gaming, and a series that is overall no stranger to being on the pricey side. With several games holding their value over $50 and a couple crossing over into triple digits, such as Mega Man 7, Mega Man Legends 2 on the PS1, and even X3's well-received prequel, Mega Man X2. You could say Mega Man X3 is one very expensive cherry on top of this rich and coveted Mega Man sundae. Overall, Mega Man X3 is one of the most expensive games on the Super Nintendo and has been this way for a long time. 10 years ago, I got a copy for around $80 before getting my hands on the Mega Man X collection for GameCube, and decided to sell X3 for around $130 just a few years later after I got it. These days, in decent shape, the game is officially closer to $200 than $100, and with the rarity that comes along with this game coming out so late in the Super Nintendo lifespan, and the fact that it's part of a trilogy, it seems nothing will change this rise anytime soon. Plus, like with a lot of these games, the box and manual take things from expensive to the out of control, I'm more expensive than a modern console level. After throwing all of these numbers out there, of course we thoroughly understand that it's expensive, but the next question to answer is it good? For those of you not familiar with the X series on the Super Nintendo, Mega Man X is reviewed as one of the very best games for the console, with its excellent control, outstanding soundtrack, phenomenal stage design, beautiful graphics, and its overall top-notch execution. Mega Man X2 is also fantastic and debatably at least about as good as the first one, with also well-made levels, bosses, abilities, and soundtracks. The X series also has some popular and well-received entries on the PS1, so one would think, since they've pulled it off so wonderfully twice before and have delivered the good stuff afterward, there certainly wouldn't be any issues with a third, right? Well, it's a loaded question and there's a lot to consider, so let's start this expensive adventure. As you can see, my current X3 copy is in rough shape, but it came with the box, and I've wanted to complete the SNES set of Mega Man games for a while. Anyway, we're hit with a similar start screen to the others. Once we begin, we're thrusted into an exciting battlefield sequence accompanied with a powerful track, setting the mood as dire and urgent, like you're only there for one last time because the world needs you to be there. The intro level is just fine, with fine pacing and enemy placement that gets you prepared for the full adventure. Seems like another promising start that's about in line with the rest of the series. Although a little more challenging, but it has a great theme with classic Mega Man X action, plus they allow you to play Zero for a little while, which I'm sure was a dream come true for a lot of fans. Zero has a huge life bar and more attacks. It's a pretty short section, but the concept itself is pretty sweet. The boss is a bit harder than you'd expect for an intro level, but in general, it's a fine start for the game. Before taking a look at a new cast of bosses you need to fight, I need to talk about my first real gripe and overall what I consider the biggest issue with Mega Man X3. For Zero's theme and even the start screen, you'll notice they're going very heavy on the electric guitar, and while the Mega Man X games have always had that rock and roll feel to them, my first real problem is their dramatic decrease in soundtrack quality. Aside from the first song in the game, I hate to say this, but I honestly don't really enjoy any of the other songs in X3, which really sucks because I love just about every single one in the two previous games, and I also love just about every song from the NES games too. X3 was just clearly handled differently in this aspect. I'm not saying I don't enjoy a single moment of it and it's like downright horrible, but there's just way too much emphasis on the repetitive, sometimes whining and droning electric guitar that never seems to stop. All the songs honestly feel like you're just waiting on a catchy chorus to show up in 20 or 30 seconds before it loops all of a sudden and you're literally just hearing the same stuff over and over again. Not to mention, the game's got some considerable difficulty, so when I say over and over, that's meant to be taken literally. While the Mega Man X games have checkpoints a time or two throughout their levels, and again at the boss, but you only have a few lives, and once you lose those, you're back at the level select screen. Some games out there are difficult for their levels alone and fall flat with boss fights, but the X games are the opposite, where the difficulty spikes with every single Maverick fight you have. These guys take some practice to learn and deal heavy damage, which means you're in constant danger of being sent back to the password screen, dude. Aside from that, Mega Man X3's cast of bosses are just fine in regard to feeling about as creative as the previous games. Although the stage select screen itself is a visual and audio step down from the previous two games. A quick comparison makes that pretty easy to see. I'm not trying to be picky here, but there's just no legitimate excuse for your presentation to get worse within a series, especially for the same console. As far as the levels go, they're all pretty good. Without going into way too much detail, I didn't notice any drastic decrease in quality, really. There are definitely those couple of spots that feel kind of empty or drawn out, a little boring to look at, but for the most part, it just feels like more Mega Man X action, and X3 dishes out plenty of punishment to keep you on your toes. The enemies deal about twice or more damage than in previous games, so that's bound to make things considerably harder, but Mega Man X3 never really frustrated me with its stage design at all, aside from how they went about hiding a handful of upgrades, but that's kind of a normal thing in the series, really. But there is this Mech Upgrade idea that should have been done way better. If you're going to implement a new upgrade system into a game, you probably should make sure the player can find it and you give them some real sections to use it. One improvement that was made though, however, if you can find this helmet upgrade, it will list the discovered upgrades along with if there are missing ones. Plus it even shows you on a map at the beginning, so you're much better off than having no idea where the heck it is. It's common that upgrades are hidden in cryptic and kind of cheap ways, which has always been a frustrating aspect of an otherwise sweet series. Of course, it's not impossible to find them by any means, but it's fair to say that finding around half of the upgrades in any of these games absolutely require above and beyond exploration. Leaps of faith or guess and check work with different weapons are mandatory. Of course, these weapons are only obtained once you manage to beat an entire level and its boss, which brings us to our next point. Let's talk about some boss fights. First, we'll briefly mention the mini-boss fights. I'm really happy that these exist in the series because they're done so well. They're creative, large sprites with a variety of abilities and attacks, and I also really enjoy that the developers didn't feel necessary to follow a formula of plugging one in every single level. That way it feels like a genuine surprise when you run into one. Since there's only a few of these in each of the games, we're only left with their most creative ideas. Despite the term mini-boss, they're all large, interesting sprites that require you to pump a ton of shots into them before victory. Plus, they're mostly active fights with plenty of patterns, so they're very engaging and I've always liked them. While not the best of the three games, X3's mini-boss fights follow suit well enough and they're memorable. Something to mention is that X2 introduced a few more of these fights by allowing you to fight henchmen within these levels too. If you enter a stage while these are present on the map, you are challenged with early fights of these henchmen before encountering them later, and the reward for defeating these three was being able to avoid an extremely challenging and fast-paced fight with Zero since you interfered with them using his parts. These henchman fights are not as elaborate and complex as the Mavericks since there are less patterns to learn, but can absolutely be more difficult since their patterns are less forgiving and more punishing. X3 brought back the henchman fights with Bit and Bite, and these are some pretty challenging fights with little room for error. Here's the weird thing with them though, if you defeat them with your buster or a weapon that is not their weakness, they will merely retreat and you will fight them later when they fuse together. But if you can defeat them with a weapon they are weak to, they are destroyed and you will not have to encounter them later. That's pretty interesting. Alright, we're finally getting to what I would say is my favorite part of the Mega Man X games, along with their music and graphics, the Maverick fights. Just, oh my god, man, the X series has what I would consider an elite caliber of boss fights. In X and X2, all of the bosses are animated so smoothly with so many moves, possibilities, and so much personality. The attention to detail is exquisite, with intimidation on the forefront, but not overly done. It's all business with these guys. Launch Octopus, signaling that you're going down. Spark Mandrill, first seen as glowing in the dark, hanging from the ceiling, before dropping down and shaking the screen with his massive stature. Sting Chameleon seemingly appears out of nowhere due to his camouflaging ability, and this is what I love about all of these intros. Many of them tell you something about the fight that is to come. From Flamestag bouncing wall to wall to confront you, Overdrive Ostrich running fast as hell in the background and jumping a mile to meet face to face. Wheel Gator at first hidden, then popping out of the water, indicating he's probably going back in there. Magnus Centipede teleporting into the fight, Storm Eagle powerfully flapping his wings suggesting he'll be using those too. There are so many examples of this and I love every single second of it, not only because it's top-notch presentation and super hype, it puts you into that moment and gives you these enemies real personality. Not to mention the sound effect of the doors locking behind you. It sounds heavy and it sounds like that shit is closed. There is no turning back at this point. Then you have the X3 bosses stepping onto the stage with animations that tell you nothing about them and they completely lose the personality that the previous Mavericks had. The amount of moves and variety of animations of the Mavericks themselves are severely cut, which further zaps the life out of the fights. The music before the fights is menacing as hell, and I can give it that. The fights themselves, though, are cut down to less moves and less animation, but more damage done to Mega Man. Some of these guys can take you out in only a few hits, or just 2 if it's Gravity Beetle, and he only does like 1 attack the entire time. In general, the boss fights go from magnificent in the series to pretty good, but more punishing than ever. As the fights go on and you whittle down the Maverick's health, they do still go into an overdrive or angry mode like they did in X2, and there is absolutely fun to be had while practicing the patterns and overcoming the challenge. It's just not done to the same level as it was before, since the patterns are easier to learn, yet are fast with minimal time to avoid, and hit like a freight train, so it robs the fights of that beautiful depth I feel like the previous fights achieved. If I were to draw a comparison, Mega Man X3 bosses play like Bloody Knuckles. It's like, here comes the attack and you better get the fuck out of the way and fast. While X and X2 are more like a boxing match where there's offense and defense. You can get creative and you're always on your toes because you're not exactly sure what they're going to do next. You can hit them with a counter and knock them off balance with a charge shot. But with X3 you just don't get that same variety, if that makes sense. The last stretch of the game is a tough one, just like the other X games, but fun to play, and it feels more like X action with some tough fights as well. The final boss is the hardest of the trilogy though, no questions. The Flying Fist Sigma shoots are ridiculously fast with no pattern, and if it doesn't go without saying, you can't duck in this game. The only way to get underneath those fists are to shrink in height with a well-timed dash. Sigma also moves fast as hell too, so you can jump to avoid his attacks, or you're just going to end up in danger due to his mobility. While this form can be outlasted and beat with some practice, he takes away so much health that the second form feels hopeless. It's one of the most frustrating things I've ever played. The attacks of both forms are just so incredibly hard to avoid, plus the second form has such a tiny head to hit, you have to see it to believe it. His body deflects anything else. This is just one of those fights where you really need your E-tanks. This is up there with the hardest bosses I've ever played, but if you practice, have the upgrades, and work your ass off to be a dodging, pixel shooting fiend, then you too can have the rare accomplishment of slaying this absolute dogfight of a game. So, this is the longest episode of its kind, and after all of that discussion, we have some summarizing to do. Mega Man X3, it's expensive, but is it good? While it is clearly inferior in almost every single way to its predecessors and hard as shit, Mega Man X3 is a good game. It's not as outstanding as X and X2, and is clearly a step backward in a few ways, but it's only because those two first games were so strong is why X3 feels like such a turd in comparison. But if X and X2 did not exist and X3 was the only Mega Man X game on the SNES, I believe people would still overall consider it a pretty good game. Just not great. Thank you for watching my third episode of It's Expensive, but Is It Good? This video definitely ended up being longer than I thought, but there was just a lot to talk about and to consider and compare with these games. This video has inspired me to make a video ranking the easiest to hardest boss fights in the X to X3 series, and has me excited to continue the series. Did any of you guys play X3 or any of the other X games? What did you think overall about the trilogy? If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe to help my little channel grow, and I really look forward to seeing you for the next episode. Thank you and have a great day.